Miss Marple and the Four Shadows of Fate. Chapter 1. A Letter in the Post. Miss Jane Marple was enjoying a quiet morning in her cottage on a mild spring day, the sun filtering through lace curtains and illuminating little motes of dust floating in the air. She had just finished polishing her porcelain teapot, a treasure passed down from her grandmother, and was preparing to settle down with a gentle detective novel of her own choosing. Her reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose, and her tidy living room looked exactly as one would expect of an elderly spinster in a tranquil English village. Neat bookshelves, an arrangement of fresh flowers from her garden, and a comfortable armchair by the window. Presently there was a gentle rap at the door, and in bustled young Tommy, the local postman. He greeted Miss Marple politely, then handed her a small stack of letters before heading off on his bicycle. She placed the letters on a polished side table. At first glance, they seemed the usual assortment of invitations, advertisements, and parish notices. But one envelope stood out. It was a soft blue colour, and the address was written in a slightly trembling hand. Miss Marple, who prided herself on her ability to notice the smallest detail, felt the slightest stir of curiosity. Pouring herself a cup of tea, she settled down to read. Inside the pale blue envelope was a single sheet of paper, filled almost to the edges with frantic, looping handwriting. The words caught Miss Marple's attention at once. "My sister is innocent. Please help us. She has been accused of murder. She could never have done such a terrible thing." The letter continued, explaining that the writer's sister worked as a maid in a large and imposing house. Her employer, a man named Lawrence Dane, had recently been found dead, and the poor maid had been discovered holding a bloody knife. Despite her pleas of innocence, everyone, including the authorities, seemed convinced she was guilty. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. She had, of course, encountered all manner of suspicions and rumours in her village life, but rarely had she received such an urgent cry for help from a complete stranger. Her first instinct was to telephone the local constable to see if he had heard any news of this affair. But the letter specifically requested her personal assistance, quite convinced that her reputation for solving puzzles would be the only hope for the accused. There was something in the tone of the letter, both fearful and utterly certain of the maid's good character, that resonated with Miss Marple's sense of justice. Innocence and guilt, she often said, were discovered in the subtle details of a person's life and the unguarded remarks they let slip. People who claimed to be beyond suspicion, she knew, could be quite dangerous indeed, while the truly innocent often seemed too frightened or too confused to defend themselves properly. Setting her cup down on the saucer, Miss Marple reread the letter, her sharp eyes lingering on every sentence. She noticed that the writer's name was Ellen Preston, and that she lived in a modest cottage on the outskirts of a neighbouring village. The letter included a brief explanation that poor Mrs. Preston was desperate, and had heard of Miss Marple's knack for seeing the truth where others saw only confusion. There was a sense of fear in her words, but also a cautious hope that Miss Marple might succeed where the official investigation had stalled. Carefully folding the letter, Miss Marple placed it back into its envelope. She cast a thoughtful glance around her home. The day had begun so calmly, and yet here was a request that could not be ignored. She was no stranger to the darker undercurrents that ran beneath seemingly peaceful towns. Over the years, she had found herself repeatedly at the edge of secrets that some wished to keep hidden, and that, once revealed, often solved the cruelest puzzles. There was always the possibility that this was a simple case of overwhelming evidence against an unfortunate girl. And yet Miss Marple sensed there could be more to the story. After all, a maid found holding a knife did not necessarily mean she had committed murder, especially if she was, by character, as gentle and timid as described. Rising with purposeful resolve, Miss Marple washed her teacup, tidied her knitting basket, and drafted a quick note to the local vicar about her absence from next week's gardening fundraiser. Then she prepared to take a short trip to meet Mrs. Preston in person. If there was a woman in distress and an innocent life at stake, Miss Marple knew she had a responsibility to investigate, discreetly, thoroughly, and with the keen powers of observation she had honed over so many quiet years in her little village. So, setting aside her leisurely day, she donned a warm cardigan, took up her handbag, and stepped out the door, determined to embark on a new journey in search of the truth. Chapter 2. A Tense Confession. Miss Marple rose early the next day and set off for the neighbouring village, a journey that involved 2 changes of bus and a winding country lane walk. The weather was fair, with a pale sun peeping through gentle clouds, and the fresh spring air buoyed her spirits despite the sombre purpose of her trip. She carried with her a small notebook in which she often jotted down observations or stray remarks that, in her experience, could prove invaluable later on. Upon reaching the outskirts of the village, she consulted the directions Mrs. Preston had carefully added to her letter. The cottage, it was said, sat at the end of a narrow lane, just beyond a small duck pond. Sure enough, Miss Marple soon found herself turning onto a gravel path edged by poplar trees. Ahead stood a modest dwelling with whitewashed walls and a thatched roof. Its garden was tidy but unremarkable, save for a row of potted geraniums adding a bright, cheerful splash of colour by the front door. She knocked gently, and after a few moments the door was opened by a thin, anxious-looking woman who could be none other than Ellen Preston. Mrs. Preston wore a simple blouse and skirt, both slightly faded. Although she was clearly trying to keep her composure, the lines of worry around her eyes betrayed her inner tension. "Miss Marple?" she asked, in a voice that held a hopeful tremor. "Yes, indeed. I hope I'm not too early," Miss Marple replied kindly. "I wanted to make sure we had plenty of time to talk." Mrs. Preston ushered Miss Marple inside and led her into a small sitting room, sparsely furnished, but warm from a crackling fire in the hearth. A teapot and 2 mismatched cups were set out on a low table. Evidently, Mrs. Preston had been awaiting her guest with some nervous anticipation. I cannot thank you enough for coming," Mrs. Preston said, her hands trembling slightly as she poured the tea. "I had nowhere else to turn. The police won't listen to me, and my poor sister just sits in that dreadful cell, so frightened." Her voice faltered. Miss Marple gave her a gentle, reassuring smile. "I'm pleased to help if I can. Do tell me everything you know. Begin at the beginning. Don't leave out the small details, as they often turn out to be the most important." Mrs. Preston nodded. She took a moment to compose herself, then began her story. Her sister, whose name was Margaret, though the family called her Meg, had worked as a maid at Morningside House for nearly 6 months. She had been desperate for employment after their mother's death left them in a precarious financial state. Mrs. Preston herself was a widow with only a small pension to see her through each month, and so Meg's wages were a lifeline for them both. "Meg wrote to me often," Mrs. Preston went on, her gaze drifting to the small window overlooking the front garden. "She liked her job at first, though she mentioned that Mr. Lawrence Dane, her employer, was often in a terrible mood. It seems he found fault with everything." A shadow of concern passed over her face. In her last letter, sent just a week before his death, she hinted that Mr. Dane had threatened to dismiss her. "I'm sure that is the only reason anyone believes Meg had cause to harm him." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "I see. Was Meg frightened by this threat? Did she seem worried it might become reality?" "Worried?" Mrs. Preston's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, deeply so. She told me she had tried to make amends, brewing the tea precisely as he liked it, making sure his room was in perfect order, but nothing seemed to please him. She thought perhaps he was troubled by something else. She felt pity for him, I believe. Miss Marple nodded, slipping a folded handkerchief into Mrs. Preston's hand. "It is often the case that people who lash out are in some private distress," she observed gently. "But do continue." Mrs. Preston dabbed at her eyes. Then came the awful day when he was found dead. You see, Meg was the one who discovered him, or so they say. He was alone in his study, and she'd gone to bring him a fresh pot of tea. The others heard her scream and rushed in, finding her holding the knife. And from that moment on, everyone seemed convinced it was Meg who killed him. She tried to say she had only picked it up, perhaps to pull it away from him or out of shock. She wasn't even sure herself, but no one believed her. Miss Marple listened intently, her hands folded in her lap. "And did your sister mention any quarrels that Mr. Dane had with other members of his household?" Mrs. Preston frowned slightly. "Only that he was at odds with his wife, but who knows the details? Meg said the mistress of the house sometimes took out her own frustrations on the servants, though she was not unkind as such, just distant, and occasionally sharp-tongued. Meg never spoke about the other residents, except to say they could be tense at times. But you see, she was new to service. She didn't know how families in large houses usually behaved." The fire crackled in the hearth, punctuating Mrs. Preston's words. A light breeze ruffled the curtains, and for a moment both women were silent, lost in thought. Then Miss Marple placed her cup on the saucer with a soft clink, and patted Mrs. Preston's arm. "My dear," she said kindly, "you have given me much to think about. It's a great help, truly. Now I want you to leave it with me. I plan to visit Morningside House myself. It's often best to see the place in person, talk to the members of the household, observe their mannerisms and their stories. In my experience, people will reveal themselves if one listens very carefully." Mrs. Preston looked at her with pure gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you, Miss Marple. Thank you. I don't know how I can ever repay you for your kindness." Miss Marple smiled gently. "We shall see your sister set free in good time, I have no doubt," she said, her tone reassuring but quietly firm. "The truth always has a way of coming to light, my dear. Always." Chapter 3. Welcome to Morningside House. By the time Miss Marple arrived at Morningside House, the afternoon sun was dipping behind a row of tall cedars that bordered the estate. The manor itself was an imposing structure of grey stone, with ivy creeping across the walls and narrow windows gazing out over the sloping lawns. A gravel drive led to a grand front door, framed by 2 stone urns, each filled with perfectly trimmed box hedges. Although the scene was peaceful, there was a subtle hint of neglect, an uncut edge of grass here, a faded patch of paint there, which suggested that tension and sorrow had overshadowed the usual attentions of a well-kept household. A housemaid, in a neat black dress, answered the door. She looked flustered, but quickly led Miss Marple to the drawing-room, without asking too many questions. The room bore the hallmarks of what once was a comfortable, perhaps even splendid, family space. Large armchairs near the fireplace, a polished piano gleaming in one corner, and a series of family portraits along the far wall. Yet, like the exterior, there was an air of unease inside. A few discarded newspapers littered a small table, and several cushions appeared to have been tossed aside carelessly. It was not the kind of chaos one might expect in a bustling household, but rather the subtle disarray left by people too distracted or anxious to maintain order. Within moments, a woman stepped into the room. She was of middle age, with dark hair pinned in a simple style, and a face that might once have been described as delicate, though now it showed signs of strain. She wore a black skirt and matching blouse, an outfit that suggested recent mourning. Her gaze was cool as it fell upon Miss Marple. "Good afternoon," the woman said in a clear but tired voice. "I'm Mrs. Camilla Dane. You must be Miss Marple. The constable mentioned you might call." Miss Marple inclined her head with polite deference. "Thank you for receiving me, Mrs. Dane. I do hope I'm not intruding at a difficult time. I'm here to see if I can assist in clarifying the events surrounding your husband's—" She hesitated briefly. Unfortunate passing. Mrs. Dane's lips tightened at the mention of her late husband. She gestured for Miss Marple to sit on a nearby armchair. "Yes, well, if there is anything you wish to know, please ask. I'm not sure what good it will do, though. The facts are fairly straightforward as far as I can tell." Miss Marple sat, resting her handbag on her lap. "I would be very grateful if you could walk me through those facts in your own words. Sometimes hearing the details directly can prove enlightening." Mrs. Dane folded her hands in front of her, lowering her gaze slightly. "My husband, Lawrence, was not in the best of moods for some time. His business affairs, from what I gathered, were challenging. He grew short-tempered, especially with our maid, Margaret. Meg, I believe. He complained that she couldn't manage his tea properly and threatened to dismiss her. On the day he died, I was attending to some household accounts in the morning room when I heard a shriek from upstairs. By the time I reached his study, I found Meg standing there with a knife in her hand and Lawrence on the floor." She paused, taking a breath. "I summoned the rest of the household. My daughter, Celia, rushed in from the garden, and my sister Beatrice came down from her room. The staff followed quickly, but by then it was too late. Lawrence was gone." Her voice trembled slightly, but she composed herself. "The police arrived, Meg was questioned, and it seemed clear enough that she'd committed the act. The constable said she had no proper alibi, and that was that." Miss Marple observed the woman's expression carefully, sadness mixed with a quiet anger. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she murmured. "I wonder if in the days leading up to your husband's death you noticed anything out of the ordinary. Did anyone quarrel with him besides Meg?" Mrs. Dane's dark eyes flicked to the window, as though searching for an answer in the garden beyond. "My husband quarrelled with nearly everyone, I'm afraid," she admitted at last. "He had a terrible row with Celia just the day before, over some matter of hers. He refused to tell me exactly what it was. I know he was also asking his mother for funds, but she refused him again and again. Money was a frequent bone of contention in this house. And then there's Beatrice, my sister. She and Lawrence—" She paused. "They were close at one point, but it's all quite complicated. Even so, none of that alters the fact that Meg was found with the knife." Her voice took on a slight edge, and Miss Marple sensed a deep tension behind it, as though Mrs. Dane might still be wrestling with her own interpretation of events. Rather than press further, Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "I understand. Would it be possible for me to speak with your daughter and your sister as well? Only if it's no trouble. I don't wish to upset anyone further." Mrs. Dane sighed. "Yes, of course, but you must remember we have all been under a terrible strain. My daughter hasn't left her room much since the tragedy. I'll see if I can persuade her to come downstairs. As for Beatrice, she was planning to visit a friend today, but I believe she's still in the house." Miss Marple stood politely. "Thank you. I promise to be as gentle as I can." As she followed Mrs. Dane into the hallway, Miss Marple couldn't help noticing the heavy hush that lay over Morningside House. Even the servants' footsteps on the upper floors sounded muted, as if everyone were going about their daily tasks in a cloud of uncertainty. There was a sense here of secrets unspoken, tensions that had built up over time and now lingered like a faint echo of the tumult that had ended in tragedy. If the truth were to emerge, Miss Marple reflected, it would require careful listening to each slip of the tongue and every hesitating pause in conversation. She clutched her little notebook a bit more firmly, preparing to discover the hidden truth beneath these silent echoing corridors. Chapter 4. A Mother's Defense. Miss Marple found herself in a dimly lit corridor lined with severe-looking oil portraits. The faces in the paintings seemed to watch her progress with detached interest, as though keen to observe what she would uncover next. At the far end, Mrs. Dane tapped lightly on a wooden door, then pushed it open. "Beatrice," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "Miss Marple is here to speak with you." Miss Beatrice Morgan, the late Mr. Dane's sister-in-law, turned around from where she stood by the window. She was several years younger than Mrs. Dane, with a soft face that might once have been quick to smile. Just now, it wore an expression of barely veiled unhappiness. She managed a polite greeting as Miss Marple entered. "I understand you were close to Mr. Dane," Miss Marple began gently, taking in the tasteful but slightly disordered bedroom. An open suitcase rested on a chair, though it appeared only half-packed. A scarf trailed onto the floor. "Forgive me if my questions seem intrusive, but I'm hoping to gain a clearer picture of recent events." Beatrice settled onto the edge of a small chaise longue, her hands wringing in her lap. "Ask anything you wish," she said, in a subdued voice. "I do want to help. Lawrence and I, well, we spoke often. He was rather unhappy." Mrs. Dane quietly slipped out, shutting the door behind her. Miss Marple had the distinct impression that Camilla Dane was neither eager nor opposed to the conversation, but simply too exhausted to remain. Left alone, Beatrice sighed and continued. "I know people have been saying awful things," she admitted. "I've heard the whispers about Lawrence and me. We were very fond of each other, it's true. More than we should have been, perhaps. He told me he was thinking of leaving Camilla. I'm not proud of this, Miss Marple, but I can't deny it." Miss Marple, her voice kind, said, "It's never easy, is it, when feelings become tangled? And relationships in a family home can be exceptionally complicated. Tell me, did Mr. Dane give any reason for wanting a divorce, aside from marital unhappiness?" Beatrice's cheeks reddened. He felt that his wife had grown cold, fixated on money and social standing. That was how he saw it anyway. I'm sure Camilla had her own story. I suppose that's why he asked his mother for funds so frequently, to keep the business afloat and to maintain the image Camilla insisted upon. She paused, lowering her eyes. "That's what he told me, at least. I can't say for sure if it's the truth, or merely what he wished me to believe." Miss Marple nodded, making a small note on the blank page of her pocket diary. "Were you aware that Mr. Dane's mother, Mrs. Euphemia Dane, had refused her son further assistance?" Beatrice let out a humorless laugh. "Oh, yes, he raged about it more than once. He called her stubborn, unfeeling. She said he was reckless and ungrateful. My sympathies lay with neither side, to be honest. I hated to see them quarrel so bitterly." She paused, taking a breath that shook slightly. "On the day of his death, Lawrence looked, well, I suppose desperate is the best word. I wanted to speak with him to calm him, but we argued instead. He accused me of pressuring him to leave Camilla immediately. I only asked him for some sign of commitment or reassurance that I wasn't making a terrible mistake. He stormed off to his study. That was the last I saw of him alive." Miss Marple patted Beatrice's arm gently. "Thank you, my dear. You've been very helpful." She rose, meaning to leave, but paused at the sight of the half-packed suitcase. "Are you thinking of going away?" Beatrice's gaze followed hers, and a brief flicker of confusion crossed her face. I was intending to stay with a friend in London, but after all this, I haven't quite had the nerve to depart. It seems disloyal somehow, rushing off. Besides, the police might need more statements from me." Miss Marple murmured agreement, then offered a sympathetic smile and took her leave. She made her way downstairs to the parlour, where she had been told Mrs. Euphemia Dane would receive her. The matriarch was seated in a stately armchair by the window, her silver hair pinned neatly back, and a cane resting against the arm. She was a woman of stern composure, her back ramrod straight. The lines on her face hinted at years of determination, and perhaps more than a little pride. "You are the investigator of sorts?" she asked, her tone crisp. Miss Marple inclined her head. "I only wish to help clarify matters, dear lady. I understand Lawrence, your son, had been asking you for funds." Euphemia sniffed. "If he'd run his business responsibly, he wouldn't have needed them. Lawrence always believed I was a bottomless source of money, but a woman must think of her future, her independence, particularly a widow of my age." Miss Marple offered a small, polite smile. "I see. Was he particularly distressed about your refusal?" "Of course." Her response was immediate, but her gaze slid momentarily to the window. "He complained and made a scene, as he often did. Yet I would never harm him. That is what some people are whispering, isn't it? That I engineered this horrible tragedy." The older woman's voice shook briefly, but she steadied herself. "Number, I may have refused him money, but I am not a murderer. I told the police as much. I do not even own a knife, let alone know how to plan such a thing." Miss Marple nodded understandingly. "Families are often more complex than they appear, though. Might I ask, did you notice any particular tension in the household besides Lawrence's financial troubles? Perhaps something involving his wife or daughter?" Euphemia pressed her thin lips together. "Camilla and Lawrence were never as happy as they pretended. And Celia, my granddaughter, she's been pale and quiet these past months. She argued with Lawrence only the day before his death. I overheard raised voices, something about marriage. Foolish nonsense, if you ask me, but I never thought it would come to this." Miss Marple studied her face, filled with a controlled pain. Euphemia abruptly stood, leaning on her cane for balance. "I can't bear to speak more of this," she said firmly. "Please excuse me." With that, she swept from the room, leaving Miss Marple alone in the silence of the parlour. A grandfather clock ticked methodically in the corner, each beat echoing in the hush that fell once Euphemia departed. Slowly, Miss Marple settled into a nearby chair, reviewing all that she had heard. Everyone in this household seemed to have a motive, or at least a cause for tension, an affair, financial worries, family disagreements. And yet Meg, the maid, was the one police had chosen as their suspect, found with the knife in hand. Miss Marple gently tapped her pencil against her notebook. There were too many unanswered questions for her to draw any solid conclusions yet. In that moment of contemplation, she resolved to speak next to Celia. The daughter might offer insight into what truly happened behind the manor's closed doors, and how it all culminated in Lawrence Dane's untimely end. Chapter 5. A hint of scandal. Miss Marple found Celia Dane in a small sitting room on the second floor of Morningside House, a quiet space that overlooked a sloping lawn and a wildflower garden. The late afternoon light slanted through the window, illuminating a girl who looked far younger than her 20 years. Celia's hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, her eyes rimmed with a faint redness that hinted at tears shed in private. "May I sit with you for a moment, my dear?" Miss Marple asked softly, entering the room with gentle steps. Celia nodded, folding her hands over the skirt of her pale blue dress. "Mother said you wanted to ask me some questions." Her voice was measured, guarded even, as though she had already practiced replies to anticipated accusations. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "But please believe me, I only wish to help." She settled on a cushioned chair opposite Celia, clasping her handbag in her lap. After a moment's study of the girl's pinched expression, Miss Marple began, "It must have been a dreadful shock. Your father's death. I'm so very sorry for your loss." Celia swallowed visibly. "Thank you. It's been awful. I keep thinking he'll walk through the door, ready to scold me for something or other." A fragile smile touched her lips, then vanished. Miss Marple waited a respectful beat before pressing on. "I understand you and your father quarrelled not long before he died. Your grandmother mentioned voices raised, and your mother confirmed the same." The girl's eyes flickered with alarm. "Did they? I'm not surprised. The walls in this house seem to carry every whisper." She drew in a trembling breath. "Yes, we argued. I told father I was in love with a young man from the village. He forbade me to see him, saying I was too young to decide on marriage, that I had responsibilities at home, and I told him I was pregnant. It just slipped out. I wanted him to understand that I was serious, that this wasn't a schoolgirl's fancy." Miss Marple's expression remained calm, though she felt a sympathetic twinge. "That must have been a difficult moment for you both," she murmured gently. Celia stared down at her hands, where her fingers worried a thin ribbon tied at her wrist. "He was livid, ordered me to leave his study, saying he'd never give his blessing. I was so angry, I might have said hateful things. Then I stormed away and went straight to my room. The next time I saw him," her voice cracked, "he was dead. I can't describe how it felt." As silence settled, Miss Marple reached over to give Celia's hand a reassuring pat. "I'm sure it was a terrible shock. Do you recall hearing anything unusual after you left the study? Any raised voices or perhaps a sudden cry?" Celia hesitated. "I heard the front door slam some time later. I think it was Aunt Beatrice leaving the house. Then a while after that I was in the hallway near my bedroom, and I heard footsteps rushing up the stairs. It must have been Mother. That's when she shouted for everyone to come. She'd found Father." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I'm sure you've heard the rest." "Yes," Miss Marple acknowledged. "But I'm curious, did you ever see your father quarrel with Meg, the maid?" "I've been told he was displeased with her." Celia's face clouded with uncertainty. "Well, father was often impatient, but Meg was a sweet girl, always eager to please. He used to say her tea was too weak or too strong. Little complaints like that. It seemed petty to me, but father was under dreadful pressure, I suppose." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Do you think Meg could have harboured any resentment?" "Enough to harm your father." A flicker of hurt registered in Celia's eyes. "No, she was timid, practically frightened of her own shadow. I can't believe she'd hurt anyone, least of all father. She didn't have the gumption for murder." Miss Marple gave a small, thoughtful nod. "Thank you, my dear, for telling me all this. It can't be easy, especially when everything is so raw." Celia exhaled shakily. "I just wish it had never happened. Everyone here seems to be turning on one another. Aunt Beatrice and Grandmother keep accusing each other in hushed tones, though they're polite to each other's faces. Mother has locked herself away most nights, crying. The atmosphere is unbearable." Understanding the family's pain, Miss Marple rose slowly. "I won't trouble you further. If you think of anything else, even something small, please come find me. Sometimes the tiniest detail can help set things right." Celia stood, managing a wan smile. "I will. Thank you, Miss Marple." She walked Miss Marple to the door, her footsteps echoing in the quiet corridor. As Miss Marple made her way downstairs, a swirl of questions filled her thoughts. Celia's pregnancy and her father's rage added another thread to the tangled tapestry of motives and misgivings within Morningside House. Who might have turned that anger into lethal intent? Or could it be that the maid was simply in the wrong place, at the wrong time? Reaching the ground floor, Miss Marple stepped into the hallway, where the hush of the house seemed suddenly more profound. Determined to find the truth, she tightened her grip on her handbag and resolved to search every corner of this old manor, physical and emotional, until the full story of Lawrence Dane's death was laid bare. Chapter 6. Secrets of a Daughter. Miss Marple awoke the next morning with renewed determination. She had hardly slept, for her mind had been busy sifting through every conversation, every small detail gleaned from the previous day. Though she kept returning to the same question, was Meg truly guilty of such a violent act? She could not reconcile that thought with the gentle, timid personality described by both Mrs. Preston and Celia. Surely a deeper truth lay hidden within Morningside House. After breakfast, Miss Marple ventured down a long corridor leading to Mr. Dane's study. She felt a slight chill in the air as she opened the door. The curtains remained partially drawn, allowing only a hazy light to filter across the once stately room. A large mahogany desk dominated the space. Dark bookcases lined the walls, filled with volumes that still carried a faint smell of old leather and dust. Stepping inside, she was struck by a sense of disarray. A few books had been pulled from the shelves and left on a side table, and a stack of papers lay abandoned on the desk. It was as though someone had been searching for something, or else had fled mid-task. She made her way to the papers, discovering a mixture of business invoices and letters addressed to Lawrence Dane. Most were polite inquiries about his failing business, but the tone in some suggested desperation on Mr. Dane's part, requests for extensions, reminders of overdue debts. Kneeling beside the desk, Miss Marple tested each drawer, finding most of them unlocked and filled with the usual detritus of everyday office life: pens, sealing wax, and random receipts. Only the bottom drawer was locked. She tugged gently on the handle. It did not budge. Her curiosity kindled. She wondered whether the key might be hidden somewhere in the study. Miss Marple rose and began a systematic search. She glanced behind framed photographs of the Dane family, peered into a dusty globe that opened at the equator, and checked the spines of the books for any sign of a secret compartment. At last, while flipping through a well-thumbed atlas on the desk, her fingers brushed against a small metal object lodged between the pages. It was indeed a key. Fighting a quick flutter of nerves, she fit it into the bottom drawer's lock. The drawer opened smoothly. Inside lay a narrow ledger, its cover dull green and scuffed at the corners. Miss Marple touched it with a cautious hand before lifting it out. As she flipped through the pages, she realized it was a personal journal, or close to it. Many entries focused on money matters, lists of debts, the occasional victory of a contract gained, and the many worries that filled the margins. Yet, as she scanned the final entries, the tone shifted. Mr. Dane wrote of arguments at home, of feeling trapped and judged, of a mounting fear that there was no escape from looming ruin. Scribbled lines revealed distress about his daughter's unexpected news. Fragments hinted at pressure from Beatrice, resentment toward his mother, and a frigid silence between him and his wife. One phrase in particular made Miss Marple's heart squeeze. "Can't see a way out. If only they understood how hopeless it all is." She turned the page. The writing tapered off abruptly, replaced by dark scribbles, as though Mr. Dane's pen had pressed too hard on the paper, leaving angry black lines. She found no neat conclusion, no direct confession, but the impression was unmistakable. Lawrence Dane had been spiraling into despair, unable to reconcile the demands of his family with his own increasingly desperate situation. Miss Marple carefully replaced the journal in the drawer. She would have to request permission from the local constable to take it away for closer examination. She was no thief, after all, but she was determined not to let crucial information vanish in the chaos that often followed a tragedy. Rising to her feet, she turned to find Mrs. Camilla Dane standing in the doorway. The woman's eyes flicked from Miss Marple's face to the open drawer, lingering for a moment on the edge of the green ledger. "You're quite thorough, Miss Marple," Mrs. Dane observed. "Perhaps more thorough than the police themselves. Have you found anything of interest?" Miss Marple gave a gentle, non-committal smile. "I've found indications that your husband was a very troubled man, dear lady. It may help explain a few things." Camilla's features tightened. "Please don't take anything from this study. The police have already searched here. I don't wish for more drama." Sympathy flickered in Miss Marple's eyes. "I understand, but it's my hope that the truth, whatever it may be, will benefit you and everyone else in this household." She slipped the key back onto the desk and stepped past Mrs. Dane into the corridor. Her footsteps echoed as she left, heart beating a touch faster. She had glimpsed a hidden part of Lawrence Dane's life, one overshadowed by frustration and hopelessness. The question remained, could it point to something other than murder? Miss Marple felt a stirring of possibilities, and as she thought about the frightened maid languishing in jail, she vowed to keep searching until all was clear, no matter whose secrets might come to light. Chapter 7. A Note in the Dark. Miss Marple stood for a moment in the corridor after her encounter with Mrs. Camilla Dane, composing herself. She sensed that what she had read in the hidden ledger might well alter her understanding of the case. Yet there were still loose threads dangling, and no definitive answer to whether Lawrence Dane had truly been murdered, or if he had taken his own life in the midst of his despair. Before she could decide her next move, a soft sound from behind made her turn. It was the housemaid who had first admitted her to Morningside House, hovering at the far end of the corridor, twisting her apron nervously. Catching Miss Marple's eye, she stepped forward. "Beg pardon, ma'am. I wondered if you had a moment." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Of course, my dear. Let's speak somewhere quiet." The maid led her toward a small alcove near the back staircase, out of earshot of the family's main rooms. She gestured for Miss Marple to sit on a low bench, then perched beside her, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. "My name's Lucy," she said, in a tremulous voice. "I've been in service here a year. I knew Meg a bit. She's always been so kind. I just can't believe she did that." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "Lucy, if there's anything you can share that might help me understand what happened, please tell me. Every detail matters." Lucy swallowed hard, lowering her eyes. "Well, I saw Mr. Dane on the night before it all happened. He looked so troubled, more than usual. He'd been pacing around the corridors, muttering to himself. I couldn't quite catch the words, but it sounded like he was talking about letting people down. He seemed near tears at one point." This admission confirmed the impression Miss Marple had formed from the ledger, but she nodded gently, letting Lucy continue. "That's not all," Lucy said, wringing her hands. "Later I went to tidy Miss Beatrice's room. She wasn't in, and I noticed a letter on her dressing table. I swear I wasn't snooping. I only picked it up to set it aside. But the page was open, and I saw Mr. Dane's name. It looked like it was from some solicitor about a divorce. Something about dividing assets, or so it read. I put it right back where I found it. But then the next day the master was gone. It seemed so strange." Her cheeks coloured at revealing this. "I daren't say anything to the police. It's not my place to meddle." Miss Marple patted the maid's arm. "You've done nothing wrong, my dear. Thank you for your honesty. Sometimes letters and documents can shed light on the truth, if only one knows where to look." Lucy nodded. I just wanted you to know there were other matters going on, things that might have driven Mr. Dane to despair, or might have angered someone else enough to do something dreadful." Her voice quavered. "But Meg didn't do it. She's not capable of harming anyone." Reassuring Lucy with a warm smile, Miss Marple left the alcove and made her way toward the entrance hall, reflecting on the new tidbit of information. A letter concerning divorce proceedings could have pushed Mr. Dane further into turmoil, or potentially turned someone in the household more desperate. Camilla, for instance, stood to lose status if her husband left her. Beatrice, on the other hand, might have believed a divorce would grant her the new life she'd hoped for with Lawrence. Could that have driven jealousy or fear? Intent on clarifying these questions, Miss Marple went outside for a breath of fresh air. The afternoon sun warmed the flagstone steps, and she paused by a flower bed filled with late-blooming tulips. Taking in the aroma of earth and petals, she remembered how often appearances could deceive. The calm facade of Morningside House masked a tangled web of secrets. Her quiet contemplation was interrupted by the crunch of gravel. Glancing up, she saw the local constable approaching with a brisk gait, hat in hand. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said. "I was told I might find you here." "Good morning, Constable," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "I was about to look for you myself. There's a matter we should discuss concerning some papers in Mr. Dane's study." He gave a swift nod. "I've heard. The family is, shall we say, concerned about rummaging through the master's effects." "I understand," Miss Marple acknowledged, "but the ledger I found suggests Mr. Dane was wrestling with grave difficulties, both financial and personal. It may be crucial to the case." The constable glanced around, lowering his voice. "You think it could point to someone else being responsible? Or perhaps it wasn't murder at all?" Miss Marple's eyes were steady. "I haven't drawn a firm conclusion, but let's just say I'm not entirely convinced Miss Margaret Preston is guilty. Something tells me there's a missing piece, some final detail that will pull everything into focus." He exhaled, looking torn. "Right. Well, the inspector in charge is keen to wrap this up, but if you have reason to believe there's more to discover, I won't stand in your way. Speak to whoever you must. I'll do what I can to help." Miss Marple thanked him, inwardly resolving to speak again to Beatrice Morgan, perhaps also to Mrs. Dane, and to find that letter Lucy mentioned, if possible. The truth was simmering just beneath the surface, waiting for one last spark of insight to make it plain, and until she uncovered that spark, she would not rest. Chapter 8. The Final Reveal. Miss Marple stood in the grand entrance hall of Morningside House, gazing up at the high ceiling and the sweeping staircase. A hush lay over the place, as though it were holding its breath before some decisive moment. In her hand she held the narrow green ledger she had found in Mr. Lawrence Dane's locked drawer, its contents hinting at a troubled mind, worn down by countless pressures. She had hoped to confer with each remaining family member before drawing any conclusions, and now she had done so. All that remained was to gather them together and reveal the truth she had painstakingly pieced together. Summoning her courage and resolving that the time was right, Miss Marple asked the housemaid Lucy to fetch Mrs. Dane, Miss Beatrice Morgan, Celia Dane, and Mrs. Euphemia Dane. When they were assembled, she also requested the presence of the local constable, who arrived shortly thereafter, face set in a serious expression. Miss Marple stood at the base of the stairs, looking up at the uneasy faces surrounding her. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "I realize this is a painful time, but the matter of Mr. Lawrence Dane's death remains unresolved, and the maid, Margaret Preston, has been accused of his murder. I have uncovered some rather important facts that point to a different conclusion altogether." A flicker of fear and curiosity danced across Mrs. Camilla Dane's features. "If you've evidence that Margaret is guilty, then be done with it," she said, a slight tremor betraying her nerves. But Miss Marple shook her head. "Far from it, Mrs. Dane. In fact, I believe she had nothing to do with your husband's death, aside from discovering him too late." She paused, glancing at the ledger. "You see, Mr. Dane was burdened by serious financial difficulties. He had asked his mother for funds repeatedly, but she refused. He quarrelled with you, Mrs. Dane, about your insistence on a certain standard of living. He felt pressure from you, Miss Beatrice, to take steps toward a divorce he was unsure he could afford. He also argued with his daughter Celia over her romantic attachment and pregnancy." All eyes swung toward Celia, who lowered her head in shame. She had already admitted this to Miss Marple, but the others had not heard the details. Euphemia Dane's sharp gaze flickered from her granddaughter to Miss Marple. Beatrice shifted uncomfortably, and Mrs. Dane's cheeks took on a pink flush. Sensing their mounting tension, Miss Marple raised a calming hand. He recorded his inner turmoil in this ledger, part business records, part diary. In those final entries, he wrote of despair, of being pushed on all sides by matters he could no longer control. There is mention of a plan to end the pain once and for all. I believe with great regret that Mr. Dane took his own life. A gasp rippled through the hall. Beatrice caught her breath, staring at Miss Marple as though scarcely believing what she heard. Mrs. Dane's lips parted, but no words came. Celia let out a soft sob, tears trickling down her cheeks. As for Euphemia, her stern facade cracked, and for a moment she looked simply heartbroken. Miss Marple continued gently. When poor Margaret entered the study to bring him tea, she found him already injured, holding the very knife that took his life. Panicking, she tried to remove it from his grip. At that moment, the household rushed in, seeing only the maid with the knife in her hand and Mr. Dane on the floor. Mrs. Dane's voice emerged in a tremble. But she was standing there, we saw her." Her gaze darted about in confusion. "It must have been a dreadful shock," Miss Marple conceded. "You assumed the worst, especially given the strained relations between Mr. Dane and his maid. But the truth can be found in his own words." She indicated the ledger. "He wrote plainly of his intention to end his life. He left no farewell letter, but these final entries are unmistakable." Beatrice managed a strangled whisper. "All this time we believed Meg had—" "Oh, poor girl." The constable, taking the ledger from Miss Marple, glanced through the pages. Slowly he nodded, raising his gaze to the group. "I've seen enough diaries in my time to recognize suicidal despair," he said solemnly. "I can't see anything here but a tragic decision on Mr. Dane's part." Mrs. Dane buried her face in her hands, tears spilling through her fingers. Celia clutched at her mother, eyes wide with a mixture of sorrow and relief that at least it was not murder. Even Euphemia, stoic as she was, dabbed at her eyes, likely recalling the arguments she and her son had over money. "At least the maid's name can be cleared now," Miss Marple said gently. "I hope you will all recognize the pain Lawrence must have felt. Let this be a lesson, if I may say so, that many tragedies stem from misunderstandings and a lack of empathy." In the hush that followed, Miss Marple stepped aside to allow the constable to do his duty, collecting the ledger as vital evidence. By day's end, Margaret Preston was freed from suspicion, and the dreadful weight that hung over Morningside House began to lift. Though grief would linger, so too might compassion, and a renewed determination that in future they would pay closer attention to the quiet struggles of those they loved. As for Miss Marple, she left with a small sigh of relief, reflecting that her role, once again, had been to bring truth to light, and, by doing so, to set the innocent free. The old manor's front door closed behind her, and she stepped into the warm glow of the late afternoon sun, well content that justice had prevailed.